Black pilot told to wait outside by racist airline staff. Minutes later, she shuts the entire company down. There are mornings when the air itself seems to hum with possibility. Every small thing, the muted clink of a coffee cup, the steady pulse of rubber wheels against polished airport floors, the soft rustle of uniforms, feels charged, electric, brimming with unspoken promise. Amira Johnson believed that morning would be one of them. Standing tall in the early light pouring through the towering glass walls of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, she adjusted the cap atop her neatly braided hair, smoothed the 4 gold stripes on her sleeves, and allowed herself a rare, fleeting smile. Today was her day. The culmination of years of sacrifice, resilience, and relentless pursuit of a dream larger than herself. Her first official command flight was as senior captain with Summit Air, one of the most respected carriers in the country. Amira's heart soared higher than any aircraft she had ever piloted. Her steps were purposeful as she wove through the terminal, dragging behind her the familiar weight of her flight case, its scuffed leather a testament to miles traveled and storms weathered. She was 37 years old. A veteran of the skies. A woman who had outflown doubt, outlasted discrimination, and outshone every whispered insinuation that she had no business in a cockpit. Her logbook boasted over 16,000 hours. Her hands knew the controls of a 737 like a musician knew the strings of a beloved violin. Still, she never took the privilege for granted. Flight was a sacred trust, and today, she would wear that trust not just in her hands, but in her title. Captain. The word tasted almost sweet in her mind. At the Crew Operations Center, the familiar ritual unfolded with precise choreography, greetings exchanged with dispatchers, weather briefings reviewed, flight plans annotated. The atmosphere buzzed with the energy of a new day in motion. Pilots and flight attendants moved through the space like seasoned dancers, each playing their part in an intricate ballet designed to launch steel and souls into the waiting sky. Amira's heart thrummed with a quiet, proud certainty as she approached the briefing room for Flight 227 to Seattle. Her flight. Her crew. Her command. She barely registered the man standing at the door, older, salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his posture casual but somehow imposing. It was only when he spoke that her stride faltered. "Captain Johnson," he said, his voice even, almost kind. "We need you to wait outside." 7 words. 7 careful, professional, devastating words. The hallway tilted slightly, though Amira's body remained perfectly still. "I'm sorry," she asked, the words crisp, automatic. The man, later she would learn his name, Calvin Rhodes, offered a placid smile. "There's been a last-minute reassignment. Captain Rhodes will be commanding this flight." He gestured to himself as if this were merely a minor inconvenience, a bureaucratic adjustment. "Please, wait outside. Operations will brief you shortly." For a long, terrible moment, Amira stood frozen. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, sterile and brightly lit, yet somehow suffocating. Behind the closed door, she could hear muffled voices, the chatter of her would-be crew preparing to meet a different captain, their true captain left outside. Her. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished glass of the operations window. Impeccable uniform. Impeccable record. Impeccable preparation. None of it mattered now. All they saw was someone who didn't belong. Someone they could dismiss with a smile and a thinly veiled excuse. A sharp memory stabbed through her, her grandfather's voice, rough with age but unbending with pride, teaching her to fly small prop planes over Michigan farmland. "You earn your wings every day, baby girl. Not by how high you fly, but by what you refuse to bow to." She blinked once, sharply, forcing the surge of shame and anger back into its box. "Not here. Not now." Without a word, Amira nodded to Rhodes, turned on her heel, and walked away. Each step was a small act of rebellion, steady, dignified, unbroken. She did not allow herself to glance back at the door that had just been closed in her face. Some doors, she thought, were never meant to be knocked on twice. Some doors needed to be torn off their hinges, but not with rage. With truth. With patience. With a power so undeniable it rendered locks meaningless. Outside, the morning had brightened, the sky above DFW a watercolor of soft blues and golds. Planes roared overhead, tiny and majestic, stitching paths across the heavens. Amira tilted her face up toward the sky, her sky, and inhaled deeply. They had asked her to wait outside. They had tried to clip her wings before she even entered the cockpit. But they had forgotten something. Amira Johnson was never waiting for permission to fly. And they were about to learn that the hard way. The hallway outside the operations room was colder than Amira remembered. Not in temperature, the air buzzed with the same clinical hum of over-conditioned space that saturated every corner of the airport, but in spirit. It was a corridor designed for movement, pilots, flight attendants, mechanics streaming through its arteries with heads bowed over iPads and flight manifests. Yet in that moment, Amira felt utterly, achingly still. Invisible. The minutes dragged, each second a slow erosion against her carefully built armor. She stood straight, her posture perfect, the lines of her uniform crisp and unyielding. To the casual observer, she might have seemed serene, even statuesque. Only the slight tightening around her eyes betrayed the war raging quietly beneath her composed exterior. In her mind, a question echoed, relentless. Why? Not because she didn't know the answer. But because some questions demand to be asked, if only to mark the injustice aloud, if only to refuse its silent acceptance. She thought about the meeting she had endured just 3 weeks earlier, seated across from the HR panel. How they had praised her resume. How they had lauded her service in the Air Force, her flawless safety record, her high evaluations. They had smiled, nodded, and written notes with brisk enthusiasm. "We are proud to welcome you," they had said, their voices syrupy with corporate warmth. And yet, standing here now, waiting outside the door meant for her, the door she had earned, Amira understood something she had tried, against her better judgment, to ignore. They had never truly opened the door. They had merely cracked it, just enough for appearances, ready to slam it shut the moment she stepped forward. Across the hall, a junior flight attendant, no older than 25, paused mid-stride upon seeing her. The young woman's eyes widened slightly, recognition flickering, then, just as quickly, she dropped her gaze and hurried on. Not cruelty. Fear. Amira recognized it instantly. The fear of proximity to someone marked. The fear that solidarity could be mistaken for rebellion. The fear that the system punished not just the outspoken, but anyone foolish enough to stand too close to them. Finally, the door creaked open. A man in a Summit Air polo shirt stepped out, clipboard in hand, expression carefully neutral. "Captain Johnson," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Operations would like you to report to Briefing Room B. There's been a reassignment. No apology. No explanation. Just an efficient redirection, like a shipping error being quietly corrected before the customer noticed." Amira inclined her head slightly. "Understood," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. She did not let them see the flicker of humiliation, the surge of anger. She tucked those emotions deep inside, where they could sharpen, not scorch. Briefing Room B was smaller, dimmer, and less meticulously maintained. The carpet bore the faint, stubborn stains of long-forgotten coffee spills. The chairs were functional but tired, their vinyl seats cracked at the edges. A far cry from the bright, bustling main room where her crew, her original crew, now prepared to fly without her. Waiting inside was a man she didn't recognize. Mid-40s. Stocky. A Summit Air Operations supervisor, by the badge on his lanyard. He gestured for her to sit. "We're assigning you to Flight 414, he said, scanning his tablet. Deadhead to Albuquerque, ride along in the jump seat. Captain Vance is in command. Deadhead. Not a pilot. Not even a co-pilot. Passenger. A warm body assigned to observe, nothing more. For a long moment, Amira sat motionless. The words pressed against her chest, suffocating her. After everything, all the training, all the hours, all the battles fought and won, they had reduced her to an empty seat. Not because she was unqualified. Not because she was unsafe. Because she was unwanted. A silent message written in the small humiliations they hoped she would swallow. You are here on sufferance. You do not belong. Amira met the supervisor's gaze, searching for any flicker of shame, any hint of discomfort. She found none. He was not her enemy. He was simply part of the machine. And machines did not feel guilt. Machines processed inputs and generated outputs. She was an outlet to be rerouted. A minor variable to be adjusted. Slowly, deliberately, Amira stood. Understood, she said again. No anger. No pleading. Just the steady, implacable dignity of a woman who had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing she could do in the face of injustice was to remain unmistakably, defiantly visible. She accepted the deadhead assignment without protest. She gathered her things. She smiled, a small, sharp thing that cut far deeper than rage ever could. And she left Briefing Room B with the quiet certainty that they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated her. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, turning the runways into rivers of molten silver. Amira paused at a window overlooking the tarmac. Jets taxied in orderly choreography, sleek and powerful, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding within the terminal walls. She watched them for a long moment, letting their graceful, unstoppable motion sink into her bones. Then, without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and began typing a message. Not to HR. Not to a union rep. Not to anyone who might offer sympathy, but no solutions. She typed to her sister, Lena, the woman who knew better than anyone that survival was only the first step. Change of plans. I'm going to need your help. Long story. I'll call you tonight. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, adjusted the wings pinned proudly to her jacket, and turned away from the window. Some battles weren't won in briefing rooms. Some victories weren't announced over loudspeakers. Some revolutions began with a woman refusing to sit down quietly in a hallway built to make her disappear. The jump seat on Flight 414 felt colder than it should have. Amira strapped herself into the narrow fold-down chair tucked behind the cockpit, the metal edges biting into the small of her back, a constant, silent reminder, you are not supposed to be here. In front of her, Captain Harold Vance and First Officer Peter Morales exchanged curt checklists, their voices low and perfunctory, heavy with the ease of men who had flown together often. Neither spared her more than a cursory glance. To them, she was background noise. An inconvenience riding their shadow. Perhaps they even resented her presence, an unwelcome witness, forced into a seat where authority could not so easily be denied. The aircraft rumbled to life, engines stirring with a deep, primal thrum that resonated through the frame. Amira leaned back, let her eyes drift to the familiar lights and gauges, the comforting rhythm of pre-flight flows. And yet, something felt off. Not in the flight itself, that remained within the tight tolerances pilots lived and died by. No, it was in the people. Small things. A missed call out here. A checklist skipped there, because we know this bird. An easy shrug when the maintenance log showed a minor discrepancy in an oxygen sensor reading, nothing serious, we fly it like that all the time. Each act alone was negligible, forgivable even. Pilots were human. Airplanes were imperfect. Efficiency was a constant negotiation with caution. But stacked together, layer upon layer, the omissions and compromises began to smell of something fouler. Complacency. Or worse. Permission. Amira said nothing. She smiled when spoken to. She nodded when expected. But inside, her mind whirred at a furious pace, cataloging each deviation, each subtle erosion of discipline that in another life, another cockpit, might have gotten her grounded or worse. Because it wasn't just about professionalism. It was about something sacred, something she'd sworn to uphold every time she placed her hand on a yoke. The unspoken promise that every life behind her belonged to her stewardship. Not to the airline. Not to mention profit margins. Not to lazy shortcuts or silent collusions. To her. When they landed in Albuquerque, Captain Vance unbuckled, stretched with a grunt, and turned to her with a dismissive smile. "Smooth ride, Johnson. You can log it as observation time." Observation. As if that was all she had done. As if she hadn't spent every minute absorbing the slow, cancerous rot threading its way through the very bones of this operation. Amira unbuckled slowly, carefully. "Thank you, Captain," she said, her voice neutral, polished, impenetrable. A mask honed from years of navigating rooms where she was admired to her face and doubted behind closed doors. At the terminal, waiting for her connecting deadhead flight back to Dallas, she found a corner seat by a window and let herself breathe. The mountains outside loomed against a sharp, dry sky, their silhouettes jagged and raw, utterly indifferent to the comings and goings of humans below. She found their aloofness oddly comforting. Pulling out her notebook, the same one she had carried since flight school, Amira began writing. Not anger. Not accusations. Facts. Aircraft 7398, deferred maintenance note on oxygen system. Captain Vance, checklist bypassed pre-takeoff. First Officer Morales, accepted maintenance anomaly without follow-up. Flight log discrepancy, unreported. No editorializing. No embellishment. Just the unvarnished truth. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was this. When the world questions your voice, your best defense is to make it undeniable. Words fade. Outrage fades. But records, honest, precise records, endure. They speak when you are silenced. They shout when you are pushed into whispers. The flight back to Dallas was uneventful. But Amira saw now with sharper eyes, tuned to a different frequency. The signs were everywhere. Maintenance crews are working faster than regulation allows. Dispatchers waving off technical delays with knowing glances. A culture where caution was an obstacle to be maneuvered around, not a principle to be revered. It wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was systemic. A machine greased by fear, denial, and ambition. And she, Amira Johnson, deadheading, sidelined, supposed to be invisible, had seen too much to forget. That night, back in her small, meticulously neat apartment, she spread out her notes across the kitchen table. The cheap overhead light buzzed faintly, casting long, uncertain shadows over the pages. She traced each entry with her fingertip, slowly, deliberately, connecting invisible dots. It was not yet a full picture. It was not yet a weapon. But it was the beginning of a map. A map to a place no one at Summit Air wanted illuminated. Her phone buzzed against the wood. A message from Lena. "You good, sis?" Amira stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "Better than good." Focused. She set the phone down. Gathered her pages. And began to chart her course. Not toward revenge. Not toward glory. Toward something harder. Something heavier. Toward the truth, wherever it might lead. And God help anyone who thought they could clip her wings before she got there. The change, when it came, was subtle. A glance held half a second longer. A nod exchanged in a hallway once filled with averted eyes. A hesitation before the casual cruelty was delivered. Amira noticed it all. She had been taught, since girlhood, to read rooms the way other children read fairy tales, parsing the spaces between words, the weight of silences, the truths people carried in the hunch of their shoulders. And now, within the sterile corridors of Summit Air, those silences were shifting. The wall of indifference was not solid after all. It was cracked. And something was beginning to seep through. The first sign came from an unlikely source, Ethan Lee, a young first officer who had once barely dared meet her eyes. They crossed paths in the crew lounge one afternoon, she heading out for a layover flight, he finishing paperwork. He hesitated, clipboard in hand, before stepping into her path. "Captain Johnson," he said, voice low. "Do you have a second?" Amira, surprised but careful, nodded. Ethan darted a quick look around the lounge, empty, save for a yawning flight attendant scrolling through her phone, before leaning closer. "I saw your notes," he whispered. "From the Albuquerque flight. You're right. About everything." She said nothing, giving him space. Ethan swallowed hard, the tension in his frame almost visible. "I didn't say anything before," he continued, words tumbling out in a rush. "I was afraid. Still am. But..." He paused, gathering himself. "You're not imagining it. The shortcuts, the culture. It's real. And it's getting worse." There it was, the first crack widening. Amira inclined her head slightly. "Thank you," she said simply. Not absolution. Not encouragement. Just acknowledgement. A hand reached across a widening chasm. Later that day, tucked into the last row of the employee shuttle bus rumbling toward the long-term parking lot, Amira found another unexpected ally. Sarah Nguyen. The young flight attendant who had once offered her a smile when others offered only distance. Sarah slid into the seat across from her, clutching a battered canvas tote. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she rummaged inside her bag, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I don't know if this helps," she said, voice trembling slightly, "but I wrote down some things I noticed. Things they told us not to report." Amira unfolded the paper carefully. Tidy handwriting. Dates. Flight numbers. Equipment failures are patched instead of fixed. Instances where cabin maintenance forms were altered after submission. A slow burn of anger flared in Amira's chest, not at Sarah, but at the system that had made this necessary. Sarah should not have needed to become a spy in her own workplace. She should have been allowed to care openly about the safety of the souls entrusted to her. Amira folded the paper again, tucked it into her notebook with reverence. "It helps," she said. "More than you know." Sarah smiled then, small, uncertain, but real. And for the first time in a long while, Amira felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten. Hope. The days blurred into each other, a relentless cycle of flights and meetings and whispered conversations. Amira added Sarah's notes to her growing dossier. She began cross-referencing Ethan's quiet confirmations against maintenance logs. She paid attention when a gate agent mentioned, offhand, how often certain planes cycled back into service after cosmetic fixes. Each fragment was small, almost laughably so. But together, they began to form a shape. Not a shadow, not a rumor. A reality. A truth too big to ignore. A truth that would not stay buried forever. Of course, the walls pushed back. Summit Air's leadership was not blind. They noticed the subtle shifts. The murmurs. The glances exchanged. And they responded the way crumbling empires always respond. With pressure. With threats thinly veiled as reminders about professionalism. With reassignments designed to isolate. Amira found herself scheduled on back-to-back red-eye flights, with minimal rest between rotations. She was assigned to routes notorious for mechanical issues, as if daring her to complain, to stumble, to give them the excuse they needed to brand her difficult, unfit. But she gave them nothing. Her paperwork was flawless. Her pre-flight inspections are meticulous. Her interactions are courteous, professional to the point of icy. They could not trap her. She would not let them. One evening, exhausted beyond measure after a brutal turn-and-burn flight to Newark and back, Amira stood at a vending machine in the employee corridor, fishing for spare change. A shadow fell across the floor beside her. She tensed instinctively. The body remembers what the mind would rather forget. But when she glanced sideways, she saw Derek Brooks, a ground technician she had noticed in passing, a man whose eyes always seemed to carry more knowledge than he let slip. Without a word, he slid 2/4 onto the machine's ledge. She nodded her thanks. He hesitated. Then, low enough that she almost missed it, he said, "You're not wrong, Captain. You're just early." Before she could respond, he walked away, disappearing into the maze of corridors. That night, alone in her apartment, Amira added a new entry to her notebook. Not dates. Not maintenance notes. Just a single line. The silence is breaking. She stared at the words for a long moment, tracing them lightly with her fingertip. It wasn't enough yet. The wall still stood. But it was crumbling, hairline fractures spidering across its surface. And she, a woman they had asked to wait outside, was becoming the hammer poised to finish the work. Slowly. Deliberately. Without rage. Without mercy. Because some walls were not meant to be preserved. Some walls were meant to fall. By the time the first cold winds of November swept through Dallas, Amira Johnson had already begun building her invisible arsenal. Not of weapons. Not of allies shouting in open rebellion. But of truth. Documented. Time-stamped. Irrefutable. She knew better than to rush. Summit Air had decades of experience in burying inconvenient truths under layers of bureaucracy and deniability. A misplaced accusation, a careless allegation, and she would become exactly what they wanted her to be. A bitter outsider. A disgruntled employee. A cautionary tale whispered between boardrooms and breakrooms alike. No. If she moved, she would move carefully. Deliberately. Like a pilot navigating a thunderstorm, eyes sharp on every flicker of warning light, every tremor of turbulence. Her notebook grew heavier with each passing week. Not just notes now, but attachments. Photocopies of deferred maintenance forms showing critical systems postponed for months without FAA authorization. Screenshots of internal memos, where supervisors encouraged discretion in recording faults. Anonymous testimonies from mechanics, careful, trembling words describing pressure tactics no one dared name aloud. Some came from Derek Brooks, who slipped USB drives into her palm during casual chats near fuel trucks. Some from Ethan Lee, who began forwarding training reminders that, between the lines, revealed damning trends. And some, most heartbreakingly, from young, exhausted flight attendants like Sarah, who feared for their jobs but feared more for the lives in their care. Every night, after the day's flights blurred into muscle memory, Amira sat at her worn kitchen table, sorting evidence into careful categories. Safety violations. Policy manipulations. Retaliation patterns. The work was meticulous, tedious, and vital. Because she knew. The battle ahead would not be won by outrage. It would be won by precision. One evening, Lena called. Amira answered on the first ring. "Still building your case?" her sister asked, voice a mixture of admiration and concern. "Brick by brick," Amira replied. A pause. "You know they'll come for you," Lena said softly. "When they realize what you're doing." I know. You ready for that? Amira leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling where the fan spun lazy circles, stirring the stagnant air. No, she said honestly. Not completely. But I'm more ready than I am willing to let them win. On the other end of the line, Lena laughed, a short, fierce sound. That's my sister. The next morning, the shift in Summit's atmosphere was almost palpable. An internal memo warned all staff against unauthorized documentation of operational procedures. Anonymous tip lines suddenly sprang up, thinly disguised as efficiency initiatives, but everyone understood their true purpose. Sniff out dissent. Quell rumors. Amira said nothing. She logged her flights. She smiled during pre-briefings. She completed every checklist with ruthless thoroughness. If they were watching, let them. There would be nothing for them to use. Nothing to spin. Only the slow, inevitable accumulation of evidence is too massive to deny. A week before Thanksgiving, Derek handed her a package during a refueling check. Inside, copies of maintenance discrepancy reports dating back 2 years, marked, resolved, without corresponding repair orders. The sheer volume of negligence laid bare in those pages made Amira's stomach turn. Structural issues. Fuel system irregularities. Pressurization faults were patched with what amounted to duct tape and hope. And through it all, the signatures of supervisors and managers who had sold their integrity, line by line, for on-time departures and quarterly bonuses. She held the papers for a long time that night, feeling their weight not just in her hands, but in her bones. How many passengers had trusted their lives to these broken machines? How many crew members had smiled, reassured, served, never knowing how close they skated to disaster? That night, Amira wrote a single line in her notebook, larger than the rest, centered on a fresh page. This is not a grievance. This is a rescue mission. She underlined it twice. Because the fight ahead was not about punishing the guilty. It was about protecting the innocent. It was about honoring the sky, the sacred contract between earthbound souls and the wings that carried them safely above. It was about remembering what her grandfather had told her, long ago, in a voice roughened by war and wisdom. When you wear those wings, girl, you don't just fly. You carry lives. You carry futures. You better fly true. In the weeks that followed, Amira crafted a plan. She studied whistleblower protections under federal law. She built a secure digital archive of her evidence, mirrored across 3 different cloud services under pseudonymous encryption. She drafted, but did not yet send, an anonymous tip to a trusted investigative journalist known for exposing aviation scandals. She waited. And watched. And prepared. Because Amira Johnson understood something her adversaries had forgotten. Flight is not about brute force. Not about reckless speed. It's about patience. Control. The unwavering, meticulous execution of 1,000 tiny decisions, each one keeping gravity at bay for 1 moment longer. She would not be reckless. She would not be hasty. She would fly this mission as she had flown every other. Steady. Precise. And unstoppable. December came with a brittle cold that seemed to seep into the very bones of the airport. The runways gleamed under low, sullen skies, the terminal lights flickered against the frost like small, defiant stars. Inside the polished corridors of Summit Air's headquarters, tension thickened with every passing day. It wasn't spoken aloud. Not yet. But it lived in the cautious glances, the abrupt silences when certain conversations drifted too close to sensitive topics. The empire was sensing a disturbance, faint but growing, and like all brittle empires, its first instinct was not to reform, but to crush. Amira Johnson felt it too. The eyes follow her longer in meetings. The sudden reassignment of her scheduled flights, increasingly erratic, pulling her from consistent routes she knew well to odd, disconnected pairings. The polite but unmistakable reminders from middle managers about team cohesion and loyalty to corporate values. It would have been almost laughable if the stakes weren't so deadly. She responded the only way she knew. Flawless professionalism. Meticulous preparation. And a gathering, silent readiness. The first real confrontation came sooner than expected. It was a morning like any other, or so it appeared. Amira was scheduled for a short domestic jump, Dallas to Minneapolis, Flight 1276. Routine. Forgettable. The kind of flight that hundreds of pilots complete every day without incident. Until she reviewed the maintenance logs. At first glance, everything seemed in order. Checklists signed. Inspections initiated. But something tugged at her instincts, a tiny inconsistency in the service record for the auxiliary hydraulic pump. It wasn't just a missed entry. It was a correction made without notation, an edit made silently, invisibly, as if the discrepancy had never existed. Amira's fingers tapped lightly against her flight case as she considered her options. Technically, nothing in the log demanded a flight delay. Technically, she could accept it and proceed. Technically. But flying had never been about technicalities. It was about trust. And trust, once eroded, was more dangerous than any mechanical fault. She sought out the maintenance supervisor on duty, a burly man named Carlos Ramirez, whose gruff demeanor barely concealed the nervous glances he cast at his clipboard. The pump inspection, Amira said, keeping her voice even. Was it completed or deferred? Carlos hesitated. Completed, he said finally, too quickly. Amira waited, letting the silence stretch. He shifted uncomfortably. It passed inspection, he added, not meeting her eyes. Then why no notation on the correction, she asked softly. Another hesitation. Longer this time. Carlos licked his lips, the gesture almost involuntary. Captain, everything's good, he said. Flight ready. You have our word. Amira smiled, a tight, professional thing. I'm sure you understand, she said, that I can't accept anyone's word in place of documentation. A beat. 2. Then Carlos sighed, defeated, and scribbled a supplemental maintenance log under her watchful gaze. The auxiliary pump had not passed full inspection. It had been functionally assessed, a vague term often used to justify flying equipment that hadn't been properly tested. Returning to the crew lounge, Amira filed a maintenance irregularity report. She knew what would follow. Questions. Delays. Displeasure. Within minutes, her company-issued phone buzzed. A terse message from flight operations. Captain Johnson, report to Supervisor Barrett's office immediately. Thomas Barrett. Director of Flight Operations. A man whose polished charm and relentless ambition were legendary within Summit's ranks. Amira had met him once, briefly, during orientation. She remembered his handshake, warm, firm, and utterly forgettable. The kind of man who smiled while cataloging weaknesses. Barrett's office was glass-walled, perched like a watchtower over the operations floor. When Amira entered, he didn't invite her to sit. He remained standing, arms crossed loosely, his expression one of manufactured disappointment. Captain Johnson, he said, voice smooth as a polished blade. We have a problem. Amira stood at ease, her hands folded lightly behind her back. Sir. You grounded Flight 1276 based on an incomplete inspection note. I grounded it based on non-compliance with FAA standards, she corrected politely. Barrett's smile didn't waver. But was there an immediate operational threat? Amira didn't flinch. Perhaps not today. But when systems fail, it's rarely convenient. A flicker passed across Barrett's face, annoyance, quickly masked. You're new here, he said after a moment. Still finding your rhythm. Summit operates differently from the military. I would hope so, sir, she said. The Air Force would never have allowed that plane to leave the ground. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut skin. Finally, Barrett leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. We value initiative here, Captain. But we also value discernment. Knowing which hills are worth dying on. Amira met his gaze without blinking. Safety is always worth it. The meeting ended with no formal reprimand. No written warning. Just a heavy, unspoken understanding. She had been marked. Not as reckless. Not as incompetent. Worse. As disloyal. As she walked back toward the lounge, Amira's steps were light, almost buoyant. They thought they were warning her. Threatening her. Trying to remind her who held the real power. But what they didn't realize was this. Their fear wasn't of her mistakes. Their fear was of her precision. Her refusal to flinch. Her unyielding mirror held up to their polished lies. They feared her not because she was wrong. They feared her because she was right, and unwilling to look away. Outside, the sky churned with gathering clouds, heavy with the promise of a storm. Amira lifted her chin to meet the wind. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was coming. And she would bring the storm with her. It began, fittingly, with a whisper. An anonymous email, sent from a burner address to a veteran journalist at the Chronicle, a woman whose work had toppled executives and brought governments to their knees. The message was short. Direct. Summit Air. Maintenance falsifications. Systemic. Evidence attached. There was no name. Only a trove of documents, thousands of pages of maintenance logs, internal emails, whistleblower testimony, curated and organized with relentless precision. Amira Johnson had clicked send with steady fingers, heart pounding not from fear, but from an iron certainty deeper than her pulse. There would be no undoing this. No recall. Only forward. Only truth. The first article appeared quietly. No fanfare. No breaking news banners. Just a link on the Chronicle's website. Cracks in the sky, an investigation into Summit Air's maintenance practices. It was enough. Within hours, it ignited. Cable news anchors fumbled through aviation terminology, their concern growing with each segment. Passengers flooded social media with their own accounts, stories of unexplained delays, mysterious mid-air turnbacks, and maintenance crews working past midnight under questionable conditions. FAA officials, caught flat-footed, issued terse statements promising swift and thorough review. Summit Air's public relations department scrambled to contain the wildfire, issuing polished, empty reassurances that only fanned the flames further. Because the documents Amira had sent were too detailed. Too damning. They told a story that even the slickest spokesperson could not spin. A culture of speed over safety. Of profit over protocol. Of silencing the very people tasked with protecting the public. Inside Summit, chaos bloomed like black mold. Meetings were called at odd hours, faces drawn tight with exhaustion and fear. Whispers snaked through crew lounges and maintenance bays. Did you see the article? Who leaked it? How bad is it? Pilots who had once ignored Amira now eyed her with a mixture of awe and unease. Flight attendants whispered her name in hushed admiration. Mechanics passed her in the halls with subtle nods, not of pity, but of recognition. One of us. One who refused to look away. Leadership, predictably, responded not with humility but with fury. Summit Air's CEO issued a public statement denouncing irresponsible leaks and vowing to root out individuals undermining company integrity. The irony was almost too much to bear. Amira watched it unfold from a quiet distance, saying nothing, revealing nothing. She had expected retaliation. Had prepared for it. But she hadn't expected this. The quiet uprising. It started small. A maintenance crew refused to clear an aircraft with a deferred engine fault, citing safety concerns. Flight attendants began logging minor cabin faults that had long been brushed aside. Pilots submitted voluntary safety reports at a rate so high that it overwhelmed the compliance department. One by one, tiny acts of defiance wove together into something larger, something undeniable. A refusal to be complicit. A reawakening of duty. Summit tried to fight it, of course. Threats were made. Careers jeopardized. But the tide had turned. And Amira, once alone, once invisible, had become the current. One afternoon, waiting in the line for security screening, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning, she found herself facing Captain Alex Monroe, a man she had flown with once, years ago, who had barely acknowledged her since. He held out his hand, rough and calloused from decades in the air. "Thank you," he said simply. No fanfare. No speech. Just the quiet gravity of one professional to another. Amira shook his hand, feeling the strength of it, not just muscle, but conviction. It was happening. Not fast. Not easily. But undeniably. That evening, standing at her apartment window, Amira watched the planes etch silver paths across the bruised violet sky. She thought about the countless passengers sitting behind those tiny illuminated windows. Sleeping. Reading. Trusting. Trusting that someone, somewhere, had fought the battles they would never see. That someone had chosen caution over convenience. Integrity over expediency. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the sharp, clean air of the coming storm. Summit Air might survive this scandal. Or it might not. But either way, it would never again be the same. The lie had been dragged into the light. And once truth takes wing, it never fully lands again. The first flame had caught. Now it would burn until the sky itself was clean. And Amira Johnson, the woman they had asked to wait outside, was standing firmly in the firelight, unafraid. The first executive fell like a tree felled in a silent forest. No announcement. No ceremony. Just a terse internal email. Effective immediately, Thomas Barrett has resigned as Director of Flight Operations. We thank him for his years of service. There was no mention of the investigations. No mention of the mounting evidence. No mention of the subpoenas quietly delivered by men in dark suits who moved through the corridors like ghosts. But everyone understood. Barrett hadn't resigned. He had been removed. Within days, the dominoes toppled faster. Calvin Rhodes, head of maintenance compliance, was escorted out under the watchful eyes of federal inspectors. Summit's chief legal counsel, implicated in document tampering, transitioned to new opportunities. The CEO himself, the man who had once dismissed whispers of dissent with a polished grin, was placed on administrative leave pending a full federal review. Their empire crumbled not with the roar of a grand explosion, but with the steady, pitiless erosion of public trust. Share prices plummeted. Partnerships dissolved. Regulators circled like hawks, their talons gleaming in the winter light. Amira watched it unfold from a measured distance, her expression unreadable. There was no gloating. No triumph. Only a deep, enduring stillness, the kind that follows the end of a long, necessary storm. The Chronicle published a second series of articles, even more damning than the first. They detailed whistleblower accounts corroborating systemic negligence stretching back nearly a decade. They quoted mechanics who had been threatened into silence. Flight attendants who had been pressured to downplay cabin safety issues. Pilots who had been quietly blacklisted for insisting on mechanical delays. Amira's name surfaced, not as a central figure, but woven throughout, quietly persistent, a thread of courage in a tapestry of compromise. Captain Amira Johnson, who first flagged maintenance irregularities internally, declined to comment on this story. It was true. She had refused interviews. This was never about headlines. It was about something harder, something quieter. Redemption. For the industry. For those who had trusted blindly and been betrayed. For the pilots who had stayed silent too long, and for those who had spoken too late. Meanwhile, the FAA issued its preliminary findings. Widespread violations. Systemic fraud. Gross negligence endangering public safety. Summit Air's operating license was suspended pending a full audit. It was a death sentence, thinly veiled behind bureaucratic language. The airline staggered on for a few more weeks, bleeding money and goodwill, before finally filing for bankruptcy protection. Its name, once synonymous with prestige, now conjures images of rot, betrayal, and corporate cowardice. The day the announcement came, Amira found herself alone in the small employee cafe overlooking the tarmac. She nursed a cup of black coffee, watching the skeletal remains of Summit's fleet, planes grounded, engines sheathed, wings heavy with disuse. She felt no pleasure in it. Only inevitability. Some structures are too corrupt to be rebuilt. They must be razed, their ashes scattered, so something cleaner, something truer can rise. As she sat there, Derek Brooks slid into the seat across from her. He said nothing for a long moment, simply stirring his coffee with a plastic stick. Then, quietly. "They're saying it started with one report." Amira glanced at him. Derek met her eyes squarely. One pilot who refused to sign off. Who filed the irregularity? Who asked too many questions? He let the words settle, soft but weighty. "That was you, wasn't it?" Amira didn't answer directly. She didn't need to. Instead, she offered a small, tired smile. "One report doesn't topple a system," she said. "It takes hundreds of cracks. Thousands of tiny acts of courage. I was just one of them." Derek chuckled, low and rough. "Yeah," he said. "But you were the first." Outside, beyond the smudged glass, a new jet, gleaming under a different airline's livery, taxied onto the runway. It rose into the winter sky, engines carving a path through clouds like a blade through silk. Watching it, Amira felt something stir inside her, something that had been battered, weathered, but never quite extinguished. Hope. Not the naive hope of a world without broken systems or compromised souls. The harder, grittier hope that comes from choosing to believe in flight even when the wings have been singed. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lena. "The Department of Transportation wants to meet. They're assembling a new aviation safety committee. They want you on it." Amira exhaled slowly. Not a reward. Not a prize. An invitation to keep fighting. To help build something stronger. Something worthy of the trust that every boarding pass, every seatbelt click, every whispered prayer on takeoff represents. She sipped her coffee, savoring the bitter, grounding taste. Then she texted back. "Tell them yes." The storm had broken. The debris was still settling. But Amira Johnson, the pilot they tried to sideline, the woman they told to wait outside, was still standing. And now, she was stepping forward. Not to claim vengeance. But to claim the sky. Before there were cockpits and crew lounges, before black coffee and red-eye flights, there was a rickety hangar on the outskirts of Detroit, and the smell of old oil and sun-warmed concrete. Amira's earliest memories were not of toys or playgrounds, but of the inside of her grandfather's Cessna 172, a worn, stubborn little plane that seemed stitched together more by memory than by mechanics. She remembered clambering into the co-pilot's seat at 6 years old, her legs too short to reach the rudder pedals, her fingers barely brushing the scratched dials. Grandfather Marcus would grin at her, a wide, gap-toothed smile that somehow made the faded flight jacket on his shoulder seem like the regalia of kings. You feel that? He'd say as the engine coughed and roared to life, rattling through the aluminum bones of the plane. Amira would nod solemnly, her small hands gripping the edges of her seat. That's the sky calling, baby girl, he'd say. And once you answer, you never stop hearing it. Marcus Johnson had been a Tuskegee airman, one of the proud few who had fought 2 wars at once, one against foreign enemies, and one against the invisible chains at home. He rarely spoke about it. Not about the dogfights over Europe, nor about the quieter battles fought in silent halls and segregated airfields afterward. But when he flew, when he nudged the yoke with weathered hands and tilted the nose toward the endless blue, Amira could feel the history in his bones. It hummed through the plane, through her. She learned early that flying wasn't about dominance, as some believed. It wasn't about conquering the sky. It was about understanding it, respecting it. Knowing that you were a guest, a brief traveler in a realm governed by forces far older and grander than ambition. Marcus taught her that, not with lectures, but with the way he spoke to the aircraft, gentle, firm, reverent. She'll treat you good if you listen, he would say, patting the dashboard affectionately. But the moment you get cocky, she'll remind you who's in charge. Amira listened. And learned. At 12, she soloed for the first time, the youngest allowed by the tiny flight club that had long since adopted her as a kind of mascot. She remembered the moment with perfect clarity even now. The wheels lifted off the cracked tarmac. The sudden, breathtaking lightness. The simultaneous terror and triumph threaded through her veins. She had cried when she landed, not from fear, but from the overwhelming joy of it. The joy of being trusted. Of proving she could hold the sky, even for a heartbeat. But life, Amira soon learned, was heavier than the sky. High school brought harsh realities. Scholarships were hard to come by for girls who looked like her. Flight schools were expensive. Doors did not swing open simply because she was talented or hardworking. They remained closed, bolted with invisible locks labeled doubt, prejudice, tradition. She fought anyway. Through part-time jobs, night classes, and endless applications. Through instructors who praised her skill but questioned her temperament for leadership. Through peers who joked, always joking, that maybe she had gotten her opportunities from special consideration. Amira learned to smile through it. To let the insults slide off her skin like rain. She had her wings. They couldn't take that. The Air Force was both salvation and crucible. It stripped her to essentials, discipline, precision, resilience. There, at least, standards were written, brutal, but clear. You flew. Or you didn't. You survived. Or you didn't. The sky was indifferent to color, gender, and history. It answered only to skill, preparation, and nerve. Amira thrived. She flew heavy transports through combat zones, threading lumbering beasts of metal through dust-choked valleys and across starless nights where ground fire flickered like dying stars. She learned leadership the hard way, not through title, but through trust earned in the most unforgiving of classrooms. When she left the service, she believed she was ready for anything. Commercial aviation beckoned, offering dreams of calm, orderly skies. Schedules. Salaries. Respect. She entered Summit Air with optimism still sparking in her chest, tempered by years of weathering storms, but alive nonetheless. She believed, perhaps foolishly, that in a world ruled by checklists and regulations, skill would be enough. That merit would have the final say. She knew better now. Merit mattered. But so did the courage to insist that it matter, even when systems bent themselves to reward complacency, favoritism, and fear. Her grandfather had fought 2 wars. So had she. Different battlefields. Same enemy, the comfortable lie. That safety could be faked. That integrity could be bent without breaking. That some lives mattered more, and some less. As Amira sipped her coffee by the airport window, watching a new generation of pilots ready their aircraft, she smiled, small, wry, invincible. They had asked her to wait outside. Had thought they could silence her by denying her the captain's seat. But Marcus Johnson's granddaughter had never needed a door held open. She had always carried her wings. And now, the sky itself was wide open, not just for her, but for all those who would follow. Because once you teach someone how to hear the sky's call, they never stop answering it. Spring crept into Dallas slowly that year, reluctant and shy. It dusted the air with the faint scent of rain-soaked earth, brushed tender green across the skeletal trees, and softened even the hard edges of the airport tarmacs. Change was everywhere, humming just beneath the surface. And Amira Johnson was ready for it. The Aviation Safety Committee had met for the first time in a modest conference room, tucked away behind layers of glass and steel in Washington, D.C. There had been no grand speeches. No flashbulbs. Just a circle of men and women, pilots, engineers, investigators, all carrying the same bruises, the same battle scars etched invisibly into their lives. People who had seen what happens when integrity was treated as an accessory, not a foundation. People who had chosen to fight anyway. Amira had walked into that room wearing her old flight jacket, the one with the worn leather cuffs and the faint, stubborn scent of jet fuel that never fully washed away. She hadn't spoken much during the first meeting. She had listened. Watched. Measured. And when she finally did speak, calm, direct, unwavering, the room shifted almost imperceptibly toward her. Not out of deference. Out of recognition. There was something about surviving the storm intact that left a gravity others could feel, even if they didn't have the words for it. In the months that followed, change rippled outward. Slow. Faltering, sometimes. Met with resistance, often. But real. Whistleblower protections tightened. Maintenance audit processes reformed. Pilot training manuals updated to include not just technical skills, but leadership ethics, the hard lessons that checklists alone could not teach. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fast. But it was forward. And sometimes, that was enough. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling strategy session, Amira found herself wandering through a flight academy newly partnered with the committee. It was tucked away near the edge of a suburban airfield, its hangars freshly painted, the scent of ambition and avgas hanging thick in the air. Young cadets in navy blue jumpsuits darted between classrooms and simulators, their faces bright with the heady mixture of nerves and hope. One of them, a slender girl with tightly coiled braids and a clipboard clutched like a shield, almost collided with her near the entrance. "Sorry, ma'am," the girl blurted, cheeks coloring. Amira smiled. "No harm done," she said gently. The girl hesitated, looking at her more closely. "Are you Captain Johnson?" Amira nodded, amused by the awe flickering in the girl's wide eyes. "I read about you," the cadet said, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You fought the big fight. You brought them down." Amira chuckled softly. "I wasn't alone," she said. "And it wasn't about bringing anyone down. It was about lifting things back where they belonged." The girl bit her lip, then blurted. "I want to be like you." Amira studied her, the earnestness, the fierce determination barely contained behind nervous energy. She thought of the long road that had brought her here, the battles fought in silence, the humiliations endured, the nights spent wondering if it would ever matter. And she thought, This is why. Not for applause. Not for articles. But for the ones who would never again have to wonder if they belonged. Because now, they would know. She rested a hand lightly on the girl's shoulder. "Don't be like me," Amira said, voice low and certain. "Be better." The girl nodded solemnly, as if accepting a sacred trust. Then she squared her shoulders, gave a sharp, awkward salute, and hurried off toward her next lesson. Amira watched her go, a small, private smile curling at the edges of her mouth. That night, back at her apartment, Amira opened her notebook once more, the one she had carried through war zones, courtrooms, and empty, silent waiting rooms. Most of its pages were filled now, packed with evidence, with strategies, with notes from a life spent refusing to wait for permission. Only a few blank sheets remained. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "The sky doesn't belong to those who inherited it. It belongs to those who dare to claim it with open eyes, open hands, and an unbreakable heart." She sat back, letting the words settle. Outside her window, stars wheeled silently overhead, ancient and indifferent. But somehow, tonight, they seemed just a little closer. Amira Johnson closed the notebook, not with a sense of ending, but with a quiet, fierce certainty. The flight was just beginning. And this time, she wasn't flying alone. The invitation came in an unremarkable envelope. No gold seal. No elaborate embossing. Just clean white paper, neatly folded, delivered to her mailbox with the rest of the day's ordinary detritus, electric bills, grocery coupons, a letter from Lena half filled with dog-eared clippings about whistleblower protections. Amira almost missed it. Almost tossed it aside without a second glance. But something slant to the handwriting, perhaps, or a sense more ancient than instinct, stayed her hand. She opened it carefully, unfolding the heavy stock to reveal a letter typed in a firm, elegant hand. "Dear Captain Johnson. In recognition of your contributions to aviation safety and leadership, the Department of Transportation and the National Aviation Reform Committee invite you to serve as Special Advisor on the National Aviation Integrity Initiative. Your experience, courage, and unwavering dedication to public safety represent the very principles we seek to re-establish. We believe your voice is essential, not just for what has been, but for what must come next. We look forward to your response." Amira sat at her kitchen table, the letter trembling slightly in her fingers. For a moment, a rare, raw moment, she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not pride. Not triumph. But something deeper, a solemn acknowledgement that the battles fought in silence, the doors closed in her face, the cold corridors she had walked alone, none of it had been wasted. It had built something. Not a throne. Not a pedestal. A path. For others to follow. For others to widen. Later that night, she walked through the quiet streets near her apartment, the crisp spring air sharp with the promise of rain. Dallas shimmered in the distance, a sprawl of light and shadow, rising and falling like the breath of some enormous sleeping creature. She thought about the choice before her. She could say no. She had already done her part, more than most would ever know. She owed nothing further to a system that had so often failed to see her. She could return to flying, pure, simple, beautiful, slipping through the skies free of committees and politics and the grinding machinery of change. But as she paused at a crosswalk, watching a small group of young students in flight school jackets laughing under a street lamp, she knew. She couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when the runway had finally been cleared. Not when so many others were still waiting for their chance to take off. The next morning, she composed her reply. "Dear Secretary. Thank you for the invitation to serve. It would be my honor to contribute to the rebuilding of our national aviation integrity, not for recognition, but because the sky deserves better stewards. I accept. Respectfully. Captain Amira Johnson." The days that followed moved quickly. Briefings. Strategy sessions. Quiet, fierce debates behind closed doors. Amira found herself at tables she had once only glimpsed from afar, tables where policies were born, where the future was not predicted, but written. She listened more than she spoke at first, weighing every word, every nuance. But when she did speak, the room quieted. Not because she demanded it. Because she embodied it, the gravity of someone who had lived the consequences of indifference and chosen, at every turn, to resist. Change came slowly. There were setbacks, compromises, battles won at the cost of others lost. But every new policy inked into existence felt like a thread woven into a tapestry larger than herself. A future where pilots, mechanics, flight attendants, all those invisible hands holding thousands of lives aloft, would no longer have to choose between silence and survival. A future where integrity wasn't just a slogan stitched onto flight bags, but the invisible, unbreakable skin of every aircraft in the sky. One evening, months later, after a marathon session finalizing the Whistleblower Protection Expansion Act, Amira stood alone on the steps of the Capitol. Above her, the night sky stretched endlessly and was aching with stars. Some were bright. Some barely flickered. But together, they formed constellations, maps carved in silence across the firmament. Paths for those bold enough to read them. She closed her eyes, feeling the cool marble under her hands, the rough seam of history still pulsing beneath the polished surface. She thought of Marcus, his hands steady on the yoke. She thought of her first solo flight. She thought of the girl with the clipboard at the academy, saluting shyly under the weight of inherited dreams. And she thought, "We fly highest not when we chase the sky for ourselves, but when we clear the way for others." Opening her eyes, Amira smiled, not the weary, guarded smile of survival, but something truer. Something that belonged entirely to her. Tomorrow, she would fly again, in committee rooms, in training halls, in every tiny unseen space where courage and integrity first take root. Tomorrow, she would climb. Not alone. Not anymore. The hangar doors rumbled open with a sound like distant thunder. Morning light poured in, scattering across the polished floors, catching on the new planes lined up like sentinels awaiting their call to the sky. Inside, rows of cadets stood at attention, navy jumpsuits crisp, faces taut with anticipation, hope, and the faint, delicious terror of beginnings. At the front, Captain Amira Johnson adjusted her tie, the silver wings on her chest gleaming faintly. Today wasn't about speeches. It wasn't about titles or ceremonies. It was about a promise. One carried silently from generation to generation, from Marcus Johnson in his battered Cessna, to the young woman who had once been asked to wait outside, to these cadets now standing on the precipice of their flight paths. The head instructor cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said simply, "meet your final training captain." He stepped aside. Amira walked forward, not with the stiff, grandiose strides of authority, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly where she stood. And who she stood for. She looked out over the cadets, a sea of faces, diverse and shining and trembling with readiness. A few she recognized from previous lectures and simulator sessions. One in particular caught her eye. A young woman with copper-toned skin and a shock of curly hair barely tamed under her cap. A name stitched neatly above her heart, Williams. Tasha Williams. Bright. Determined. Relentless. And already a better pilot, Amira suspected, than she had been at that age. Good. The world needed better. The world deserved better. Amira took a slow breath, tasting the electric charge of the hangar air, the same breath she had taken before every takeoff, every mission, every choice that mattered. "You stand here today," she began, her voice low and clear, "because you chose not just a profession, but a responsibility." A hush fell, deeper than silence. You chose to carry lives, strangers, loved ones, dreamers, doubters, all trusting you without knowing your name, your story, your heart. She paused, letting the truth of it sink in. "And you carry something else, too," she continued. "An invisible chain that stretches back to everyone who fought for the right to sit in that cockpit. To touch those wings." Her gaze swept the room, steady and unwavering. "Honor that chain. Strengthen it. Make sure it never breaks. No applause. No cheering. Just the quiet, solemn gravity of a vow made and accepted." Amira smiled then, not the guarded smile of defense, but the open, radiant smile of someone who had found her place in the constellation. Later, as the cadets filed out toward the planes, Amira stood alone at the hangar's edge, watching the first group taxi into position. Tasha Williams climbed into the left seat, captain's seat, with a confidence that brought a lump to Amira's throat. She recognized the look in Tasha's eyes. Not arrogance. Not entitlement. But belonging. Undeniable. Irrevocable. The engines roared to life. Wheels rumbled across concrete. And then, impossibly, beautifully, the aircraft rose, lifting into the morning sky, silver wings slicing through the blue with the elegance of a prayer answered. Amira watched until the plane disappeared into the sunlight, a tiny, gleaming speck racing toward horizons not yet written. She felt no regret. No wistfulness. Only a fierce, quiet joy. This was not the end of her journey. It was its truest beginning. She turned away from the runway, the wind tugging playfully at her jacket, and walked back into the hangar where more cadets awaited. More dreams waiting to be fueled. More battles waiting to be fought, and won. The sky didn't belong to the old guards anymore. It belonged to those willing to fight for it anew every day. To those who understood that flying wasn't just about taking off. It was about lifting others with you. It was about refusing, always, to wait outside. And somewhere high above, invisible to the eye but not to the heart, the sky stretched endlessly and was welcoming. Waiting. Ready. Amira Johnson smiled once more. And stepped forward, into the forever.